Start the recording when you start talking?
Yeah, go ahead. Okay. People are going to start coming in now. Welcome, everybody. As you're coming in, if you would let our speakers know who you are and where you're from in the chat, that would be great. Also buys us some dead time, because I know how deadly the quiet is on Zoom. While everybody's coming in, and we'll give you a minute to do that. I see a couple people have raised their hand. Okay, Patty, I'm giving you a minute to talk.
The chat's disabled, Judy.
Oh, no. Okay, that's unfortunate. Tammy, if you would let Sally know, please, that our chat is disabled.
Yes, I will do that right now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I don't know, Kelly, were you going to say the same thing, maybe?
It might work now. Give it a shot.
Okay.
It's working. If you can see my chat message.
You know, I don't. Oh, there we go. I see Sean. Hello, Sean. Thank you. What's interesting is my chat shows up people only who write their name. So if you want to be on my chat, you better sign in and say hello, or you're not going to show up. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. Thank you, everybody. Kelly, I see your hand up. Did you want to say one thing before we begin? Okay, I'm going to lower your hand. All right, everybody. Thank you very much for being here today. We have a very interesting and timely presentation given the moratorium that has been in place for over a year now. And knowing what a hot topic it is, our presenters today are going to be talking about disconnection practices, how different utilities are dealing with non-payment, and the results of the survey members that were asked to complete earlier this year. And they'll even cover a bit about alternatives to disconnection. So before I begin, I would like to take a moment to thank this year's conference sponsors. They're listed here on the slide that you can see. And you know as well as I do that these folks really are so important to the success of not only the association, but all of you because of the services and products that they provide you. Before we begin, I want to orient you or reorient you or remind you about the platform. The theater button down at the bottom there can make your screen larger. And the gray button gives you the option for taking notes and downloading them later. We are going to be taking questions throughout so that you can put them in the text. And if you haven't already, go ahead and put your name in there and let our speakers know where you're from. So now I want to introduce you to our presenters. We have two for this session. Elsa Marie Mullins is a project director at the Environmental Finance Center at University of North Carolina. And she provides trainings and technical assistance for water and wastewater providers. This past year, she has been focusing on the impact of COVID-19 on utilities. And she's joined today by Anna Lyles, who is a current Master of Public Health candidate at the Gilling School of Public Health, concentrating in environmental health solutions. She joined the Environmental Finance Center this year, and she's researching the effectiveness of water disconnections as a tool for utilities. With that, I will turn it over to you, Elsa Marie.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Judy. Of my own intro and title slides, but I really just want to thank you all for allowing us to speak. This topic is definitely one that is gaining interest now, but a lot of folks have been looking at it for a long time, and I feel like I'm in the middle of learning a lot as well. I'm so excited to learn from you as well as to share what we do today. So I want to just tell you a little bit more about the Environmental Finance Center, especially if you haven't heard of us. Our mission is dedicated to enhancing the ability of governments and other organizations to provide environmental programs, and that really is focused on water, wastewater, and stormwater services in fair, effective, and financially sustainable ways. So as Judy mentioned, I do a lot of direct advising and technical assistance, as well as applied research, and I really enjoy the combination of talking to folks who are on the ground, working with things, and helping customers and trying to decide what the rates are going to be, as well as talking to people at the state level, wondering what they're thinking about and what they want to do, and how funding is distributed, all these kinds of large, big picture questions I enjoy as well. So as part of my work, I get to do both, and I'll let Anna introduce herself briefly as well.
Hey, as Judy mentioned, I am a Master's of Public Health student at UNC in the Gilling School of Public Health. I concentrate in environmental health solutions, and I have been working with Elsa Marie at the Environmental Finance Center this past year, researching disconnections.
So our tagline at the EFC, where you can kind of sum up our work, is how you pay for it matters, especially how you pay for water and wastewater services. So now you've heard a little bit about us. I would love to hear a little bit more about you all. If you could put in the chat your answer to this question: how many people do you serve? So this is service population, not number of accounts. But if you want to do a quick estimate, we usually estimate about 2.45 accounts or people per account. So we'll give you a couple minutes to, well, maybe like 30 seconds to put in the answer there. I see 2 C's and a D, so mid to larger systems. I'll give you all another 10 seconds. Some more C's. Awesome. So the most common answer I see is 10 to 50,000. And I've only seen 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So if you don't see your answer going to all panelists or all panelists and attendees, we won't be able to see it. So make sure you can see that in the chat. The second question is, what services do you provide? Drinking water, wastewater, or both? This should be a pretty quick one. All right, so I can see that we've got some of water, wastewater, and drinking water, which is great. We're kind of going to be talking to all of you today, whether you just provide water or drinking water or wastewater or both. So I'm going to quickly go over the agenda before we dive in. We're going to give a bit of context, why are we talking about disconnections, why now, and what information is already out there. We're going to go over some common practices, which includes results from the survey, some case studies, and intermingled with those, we're going to discuss some possible alternatives or things to consider when you're thinking about billing practices and disconnections. And questions are welcome anytime. So feel free to put a reaction or a question in the chat. Anna and Judy will be monitoring those, and I can pause for questions at any time, and there'll be some specific parts where we pause as well. So first off, a bit of context. One of the ways that I like to think about utilities is they're doing this great balancing act. So water and wastewater utilities provide essential public services by providing drinking water and wastewater treatment, which really protects public health. Without proper infrastructure and utilities, we'd have a lot more disease from water-related disease. This is a primary goal. But in order to achieve that goal, you need money to run your system. And it seems like costs are only going up for construction, for compliance, and without running your system, you can't protect public health. And a special note is that districts, you all don't have a general fund to fall back on. So we do work a lot with municipalities at the EFC, and oftentimes they can use a general fund for a transfer if they need, or They're not supposed to, but or for a customer assistance program. But as districts, you have to function just with your revenue from rates and fees. Given that you need money to operate, it makes a lot of sense. But there are, and there always have been, some customers who cannot or will not pay. Or they might forget to pay, or they might move, or they may not know about their bill because their landlord didn't send to them, hence disconnections. So disconnections can be a really powerful tool for encouraging folks to pay who haven't yet paid, because it's really important to make sure your revenue covers your costs, or else you can't meet that primary goal of protecting public health. And I kind of divvied up some of these purposes of disconnections just to sort out some of the things. And the primary is to collect revenue. And I split that between customers who forget to pay and encouraging customers who cannot pay to get help. There could be some other subcategories too. There are a lot of nuances between customers who may have to choose between their electric bill and their water bill that month, so they do that, or between groceries and their water bill. So there's a lot of different bits there. Sometimes, although it may not be the primary stated purpose, utilities use disconnections to gather information in terms of which properties are vacant and what billing or collection or address errors there might be. You know, if you go to disconnect someone and you realize that's not where the address was, so the bill wasn't getting to the person, or the tenant and the landlord aren't communicating well, or whatever it is, sometimes, even though it might not be the stated purpose, disconnections can help gather information. And then not having to do with payment, but sometimes for maintenance and repairs, utilities disconnect. And if there are any more purposes for disconnections, you can share those in the chat. Today, we're really going to be focusing on that primary reason and stated reason for disconnections is to collect revenue. But it is kind of important to remember, just think about if your utility uses disconnections to gather information, whether or not that's really accomplishing the purpose of the disconnection, or how you might go about collecting information maybe differently to protect the public health of the customers who live there. So, you know, disconnections aren't a new subject. People have been talking about them for a while. There have been cities like Detroit and Philadelphia and Baltimore that have been kind of the front lines of some of these studies that look for water shutoffs, look at water shutoffs. So graphs like these, water shutoffs per 1,000 residents, are available for these sorts of cities. And there have been a lot of news articles written about them before. And Philadelphia has this new tiered assistance program. But what is new about this year, obviously, is COVID and the resulting moratoriums on shutoffs that have been widespread across the country. And how now that moratoriums have happened, some customers, customer advocates, lawmakers are talking about having permanent moratoriums. And on the other side, there are people talking about and introducing bills that protect utilities from any moratoriums, so saying, you know, the governor is not allowed to dictate whether or not you're allowed to shut somebody off. So kind of on both ends of the spectrum, there's been a lot of talk about disconnections and related to public health, especially in the middle of a pandemic. So I went digging and I tried to find a bit more of what was out there. And I didn't find a whole lot. So I wrote a blog asking, you know, people have been talking about disconnections, but where's the data about them? There are a few reports out there, and Anna will go over those. But there's a lot of information missing. You know, what is the cost recovery like? How much does it cost the utility? How much does it benefit the utility? How much does it benefit the customers or cause the paying customers to pay more? You know, without this kind of more comprehensive data, I wonder how utilities and policymakers can determine the true costs and benefits of disconnections for utilities. And I think that's a piece that's missing in the conversation. A lot of times you're talking about protecting public health, which is super important. Obviously, you want to provide your customers with good service. That's why you're in the business. But the importance of disconnections as a tool for payment, I think sometimes that can be lost in the shuffle too. And so without having the information to really prove that that's true, or you know, show how much it's true or in what ways it's true, I think it can be tough to make the case. So I kind of wrote this blog asking people to, you know, where's the data? And it makes sense because utilities can be reluctant to share that information for either public relations purposes, or it can be hard to calculate, how much administrative time do you really spend compiling those lists? But it can also be worth it so that you understand what your utility is doing, and then what other people are doing too. So Anna is going to go over some of the things that are out there in terms of information on disconnections and some of the strengths and weaknesses of the data that's already available.
So the first report we'll look at is from the Food and Water Watch. It was titled America's Secret Water Crisis. And this is one of the more prominent reports detailing disconnections in the US. This report surveyed about 73 utilities across the country about their disconnection policy, and these are their findings. They found that utilities shut off about 5% of households for non-payment, and from reports of the survey, about 500,000 households lost water service for non-payment. Overall, the report estimated that 15 million people in the US experienced water shutoff in the year 2016. And then to the right, you can see a map that's detailing where the surveyed utilities were and their estimated shutoff rates. This is one of the major sources of data we have about shutoff rates, and it's pretty lacking. They were only able to measure responses from 73 utilities, and they didn't take into account some of the nuances of what goes into water shutoffs. It demonstrates kind of what Elsa Marie was saying, that we don't have sufficient data about water disconnections across the US. So we can go to the next slide. In the next report, we're going to look at focuses more on disconnection costs. It's from the Pacific Institute fact sheet in 2018. And this report only included California utilities and what their disconnection rates and fees were like. The figure to the right shows the annual disconnection rate for utilities surveyed by the number of connections. And you can see that most of these utilities had rates under around 10% for disconnection. Fees for disconnection were also detailed in the report, and cumulative shutoff fees for customers were around $166. And then reconnection fees ranged from $50 to $300 based on household income and time of the week the reconnection occurred. So for example, low-income households had subsidized costs, and weekend reconnections were more expensive than weekday ones. The report also stated that disconnections were costly for utilities, but did not really share any data to support that statement. So in the next slide, we have a poll, and if you could just answer this in the chat, what % of customers did you disconnect in each year prior to COVID? So you just let us know in the chat. We'll give that about 30 seconds. See one response for A, less than 1%.
I think we might be missing some responses because we only had one, and my guess is that more people have responded. So I think Judy had mentioned before that if your name isn't your name, maybe, then you need to rename yourself. I'm not exactly sure. But if you don't, also if you end up not being able to ask a question, especially in the chat, you can also ask a question on the Pathable, the like agenda, the platform for the meeting, and we'll check that at the end as well. So if your question doesn't show up there, then that's fine.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the answer we got was A, less than 1%. And also that information wasn't available, which is unfortunately true for a lot of utilities. But we also see, yeah, less than 1% is common, but also between, I think BWWA cited about 2%, 1 to 2% in their report in April of last year, looking at the impacts of COVID.
Yeah. So here we're gonna go over briefly some alternative solutions to disconnections. The first one is probably the most common, and it's customer assistance programs. These vary pretty much from utility to utility, but are generally designed to aid low-income customers in bill payment. And they often struggle with low enrollment in these programs, so the programs aren't necessarily as effective as they could be. A newer type of assistance model is the tiered assistant program. This is based in Philadelphia and uses an income-based billing system. So customers don't need to be delinquent to qualify for this assistance program and are often automatically enrolled based on their income. And then the last one is flow restrictors, and these are a relatively new approach. These devices are cheaper to install than the cost of disconnection often, and they are used to reduce the flow of water to a house, making water use inconvenient for customers who have not paid their bills in order to encourage bill payment without completely shutting off water. And these were meant to be tested in Phoenix. And I think Elsa Marie will talk a little bit more about that later in the presentation.
Yeah, we'll talk about these things, but kind of what Anna outlined is what you'll see in the literature most often when you're looking for disconnections and information on them. So we're going to go through some of the common practices. And first off, I'm going to go through results from the survey that I sent out to all of you, thanks to Judy. So first off, every utility has their challenges and their strengths, and that's no different when it comes to disconnections. And we found that we got 8 mostly complete responses from districts ranging from 3,700 accounts to about 35,000 accounts from water, wastewater, and both. And in the survey, we asked questions about billing and fees, you know, policies as well as numbers, the eligibility for disconnections, notifications, if there were customer assistance programs, and then percent and number of customers that were disconnected and reconnected after so many days and different things. And then the cost for the disconnection for the utility, both the field cost and the administrative cost. So we are not going to have time today to get through all of the questions and results. And we also are not done with the survey. So you can still participate in the survey by May 7th. And all the data will be anonymous. The link is there and we'll put it in the chat as well. And I'm going to do that right now. Yeah, and even though, like I said, every utility is different, it gives us some idea of the range of possibilities and some look at the numbers. And so it's at least a starting point. So, and then after the survey closes, I'll write up a report that will be circulated with all of you. Again, it's completely anonymous. So please go fill out the survey. There's also the survey questions are in the conference platform along with the slides for today. So first off, I asked about disconnections for the utilities that answered. I got a range of 0.5 to 5% of their customers that are disconnected every year, which is within a pretty normal range, but also kind of indicates the wide variety, because that's an order of magnitude different. And so this graph shows the percent of customers of those that were eligible. So of those 0.5 or 5%, those that were eligible for disconnection. The blue bars are the percentage of customers that paid after the notice was sent. And the red bars were those that paid after disconnections happened. So notices encouraged everywhere from 50 to 98% of customers to pay right away from the second and third bars. And then disconnections encouraged everywhere from 90 to 99% of customers to pay. So for some utilities, the difference between sending a notice and disconnecting customers meant a difference in revenue collection. For others, you know, going from 98 to 99% wasn't that much of a difference. Now, granted, would people have paid on the notices if there was no disconnection? That's a huge question. But so I'm not saying that the notifications are completely separate from the disconnections, right? They're tied together. But it's important to note that that noticing, like doing notices, can be an effective tool for encouraging payment. And one other thing to note is that no one reported 100% of the customers being able to pay. And so I'm going to say this later on, but I want to just keep in mind that 1%, you know, of those who are not able to pay, not even after, you know, 10 days of being disconnected or 2 weeks of being disconnected, and what are their options for clean water. So just to keep in mind, that 1% on the other end of the spectrum, not the 1% that holds most of the wealth in the world. And so when we think about disconnections, one of the pieces that's missing is the costs. And so I asked about the disconnection costs for compiling the list and sending the notices. On the x-axis, we have the number of customers that are on the disconnection list. And the y-axis is that cost that was reported for compiling the list and sending the notices. We see a wide range for utilities, but the average cost for sending the notices, compiling the list was about 40 cents to $29 per customer, which is a huge range, but maybe that's because some notices were sent, some people sent several notices, the cost of calling customers, whatever it is. And one of the questions I had is that cost for the administrative and sending notices covered by the late fee? And that depends, because everyone who reported that late fees were 10% of the bill. And with the minimums amounts needed for a bill to be considered late, that could range from a minimum of $1 to $25. So in terms of if costs are being covered by, sending out notices and being recovered by a late fee, it really depends on the utility, but it's about the same range, at least for this group. So that's only one piece of the cost, right? Another piece of the cost is actually going out and doing the field work, rolling a truck. And we see that for most the utilities that responded, again, there's only 6 here, most said it cost between $25 and $67 to roll a truck, send somebody to disconnect per customer. There's one that's a lot higher at $500. And I think these were the wastewater only district. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later as well. There's a quote. So then the question is that covered by the disconnection fee? And we found it probably, because the disconnection fees were between $45 and $75. The costs were between $25 and $67, so they're probably covered most of the time, except for that $500 cost of the sewer disconnection. But also with the disconnection fee, the $250 after hours fee, one of the utilities noted, which is pretty common practice, and is higher cost because that could be overtime or whatever it is to get somebody in there after hours. I also asked about methods of notification. So this is kind of what is involved in that cost of notification. Everyone we surveyed said that they mail notices. Some had a first reminder and a second reminder, some only one. One utility robocalled, and one utility used door hangers. And incidentally, they were at the lowest disconnection rate of 0.5% of their customers whom they actually disconnected. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about door hangers later, but I think they can be a good physical reminder. And then I asked a bit about if COVID had changed policies or if they'd saved any money from not doing connections. And really it was split. 4 said, no, it's not going to permanently change our policies, and 3 weren't sure. And I think the quote here kind of highlights a lot of folks that I've talked to, and their kind of feelings about disconnections and if COVID changed things, thinking, you might need some different options, but we're always going to need shutoffs as like a backstop for, if folks really are not going to pay, we need to have that. And part of the reason that you have that is so that bills don't get super high, and then customers have even more and more. So if you don't shut someone off for 6 months, their bill is going to be a lot higher than if you don't shut them off for 1 month. And so that was kind of encapsulated in that quote. And then I asked if they had saved any money from doing disconnections. So one utility responded that they've shifted work duties to other maintenance and capital projects. We found that in one utility in North Carolina, staff were able to look through their zero read meters and check up on those meters, maybe replace them or fix whatever was going on so they didn't have as many zero reads, which was a great use of time. And then the sewer district that responded said that the sewer disconnections can be really expensive because they're literally digging up and finding the sewer output and then capping that or plugging it. And so they're very expensive, and they try to avoid them if at all possible. So in that case, maybe avoiding disconnections is even more valuable to the sewer district because it's so expensive to do it. So from this very condensed bit of data from this survey, we have a couple key takeaways. And the first is that every utility is different. So, but that assessing your customer patterns could be helpful in deciding about your policies and disconnections, and we'll go more into that later. And that the notice of disconnection often compels payment and costs less per customer than disconnection, compels from 50 to 98%. But disconnection compels often that extra bit up to 90 to 99% of payment. And then there's a lot of uncertainty in terms of if COVID has permanently changed policies. That's partly at the district level, but also at the state and federal level in terms of policies. So there's much more to report on that I asked about, including I've calculated out some of the actual cost recovery, the billing practices, the customer assistance programs I didn't even include in these results. But if we have even more data to work with, then we'll have an even more robust report. So again, another plug, please finish the survey by May 7th if you're able. Again, that PDF is on the conference platform. If you want to, just download that PDF and send it out, fill it out by hand and send it to us. That's totally fine, but there's also the online version. Okay, so we've kind of gone over some of the context and common practices for disconnections. We're going to talk a little bit more about exploring some of the alternatives and general practices around disconnections and kind of what could this picture look like and what are the things involved in a disconnection. So one thing I hear folks talk about sometimes is kind of the front end versus the back end practices to help customers who can't pay or won't pay. The front end are things like looking at your rate structures, and the back end is something like using a disconnection. So, what happens even before someone gets their bill that determines how much they're going to need to pay versus what happens when someone cannot pay their bill. But I'd like to suggest that it's actually a lot more nuanced than just front end or back end. So the rate structure does matter, and the rate structure can determine what the bill is. And if someone can't pay their bill, it often goes to a late fee. And then if they aren't able to pay after that, then it can go to a disconnection and then possibly reconnection. And then it's important to note they go back into the rate structure. So there are some things that you can't control about a customer who can't pay, like their employment status or their electricity bill. But the rate structure is something that you can think about. So in the rate structure, if there's an allowance for a base charge, if there's a low income customer class or senior bill discount, these are things that might make someone who doesn't use much water and doesn't have much money at the same time have a lower bill. And then if we go along this cycle, we can see there are things as well. So even if someone is in a certain rate structure, if they have a leak or they have really inefficient appliances, there are things a utility can do to support them in, reducing that bill. So there are utilities that have an appliance efficiency program. So you get a low flow toilet and they'll help you pay for half the cost, or there'll be grants associated with one of these things. Some utilities literally help people find leaks and fix them. And then a lot of utilities offer a one-time leak adjustment, especially if someone gets the leak fixed and brings that receipt, that proof that that leak has been fixed. And so that's a way to help reduce a bill that could lead to a disconnection, farther up this cycle. And then the policies, thinking about the number of days, the types of notices, the number of notices, the minimum amounts for a late fee or disconnection. If someone has a $10 bill that they can't pay this month, but then the late fees added and that's $5, and then the disconnection happens and there's a disconnection fee of $100, then all of a sudden, they have a $125 bill when they really started with $10. So of course you want to recover your costs of disconnecting folks. But if your minimum is a little bit higher, then that means that if somebody, can't pay this month, but they're able to pay their $40 bill next month, then they can do that. And then the same thing happens, in between disconnection or having the late fee and the disconnections. I kind of noted this, how do all of those fees kind of add up? And then also taking a look at your disconnection practices. Are they fair? Are they consistent? Are they equitable? I found a lot of utilities have a procedure that's in their ordinance or in their policies, but how it actually gets played out might be different and might disadvantage certain customers or cost you more money than it needs to. So that's something else to consider, literally just how you're disconnecting. So then we get on kind of like these are kind of like back end ways to work with customers that are that have late bills, delinquent bills. At this point, a lot of customers with disconnections will ask for bill assistance. And I particularly use the term bill payment assistance program here and not customer assistance program, because the customer assistance program could be considered a senior discount or a leak adjustment. But a bill payment assistance program is particularly aimed at when someone has a bill and they cannot pay that bill. So it's not necessarily a leak or a reduction, even though those are kind of the front end ways to address this. So a question for bill payment practices is, when can a customer apply? Do they have to be disconnected entirely in order to then get the help with paying their bill? A way to filter out and have less of your customers disconnected, less of your time tied up in disconnecting customers would be to have folks be able to apply for such a program as soon as they get their bill, or when they get their late fee, if they can prove a hardship or whatever, whatever the requirements are. That's something that the utility can set, or as you're partnering with third-party nonprofits, that's something that you can encourage them to do and say, maybe before someone's actually disconnected, you can help them pay their bill. And that saves you time and money, and it also protects their public health. So where flow restrictors fall would be, at that end of a disconnection, it would be instead of a disconnection, and providing just a bit of water before the bill's paid off and it's reconnected. And we'll talk more about those later. So you might think, okay, that's the full cycle, but something else to think about is when somebody's reconnected, getting them back on track, and then they go back into a rate structure. So you can look at your customers and think about, those who get disconnected often. Maybe those are customers you can target more specific communication or dedicate more staff time to saying, okay, let's really contact these customers because they're costing us money as we're disconnecting them. And obviously they're having trouble paying. If we can get them hooked up with a program or some kind of community assistance, then that will be better for us and better for them. Or if someone is disconnected and they don't get reconnected, some people may pay and get reconnected right away. Others may not be able to pay for 10 days. If you think about the folks who can't pay for a really long time, then maybe those are also folks to target with more intense communication. So I've mentioned, so these are just a lot of different ideas about ways that you can make the process of disconnections either more lenient or more fair, or other things besides just flow restrictors to think about how to make it so that less customers are losing water service. So I've mentioned customer assistance programs a bit. I have just threw up some of the things here that were considered under Governor Inslee's previous iteration of 2023 to be customer assistance programs. But mostly I'm just going to direct you to your Office of Drinking Water here. They are great and they have really good guidance. That link and these are in the PDF slides, will take you to their website. I'm sure a lot of you have looked at those before. But one thing to note is that yesterday in the plenary session, Curtis Chambers mentioned that they will almost certainly have a requirement for some kind of customer assistance after the moratorium lists. So I'd encourage you to think about it. And I'm going to share, I've done a bit of gathering information from utilities in North Carolina about payment plans specifically. And so I'll share a couple of lessons I've learned here. And hopefully, as you all are thinking about, if the moratorium really expires in July, what that will look like for your utility and your assistance and your payment plans. But I'll just share a little bit here. There's also a lot more in this. This is a one-page summary here of a report we wrote in January that detailed a lot of the lessons learned from the transition in North Carolina from moratorium to no moratorium. So in North Carolina, utilities were required, there was a 4-month period where we couldn't disconnect for residential customers for non-payment. And we were required to provide at least a 6-month payment plan with reasonable terms. And many utilities chose different options. It was a bit of a chaotic transition because there wasn't much guidance for the payment plans. And so here are some of the lessons we've learned. If you want more, you can go to the report. The biggest thing is partnering with nonprofits. Start that early and talk to them often. Partly because there will be other municipalities, districts, housing offices, churches, there will be other people trying to do the same thing and partner with nonprofits. So if you get your communication and your partnership going sooner, then it's more likely that you'll be able to easily point your customers to them, they'll be able to get more assistance, and then that revenue will come back to you. And so this is just a great way to make sure that your customers are getting help. A lot of nonprofits are better equipped to run a customer assistance program than a utility in terms of determining eligibility and other things. And then another benefit is oftentimes you can find a nonprofit who's doing utility assistance, but also rent or mortgage assistance or food assistance. And so if you can consolidate all those resources into one place, that could be really beneficial. So I'd say look for the nonprofits that are already doing this kind of work and then talk with them, see if you can share data with them. There's a utility in North Carolina that gave a nonprofit zip code level data for delinquencies and arrears. So they could apply for a grant that was specifically targeted at a low income population within the district, like within the service area. It wasn't even the whole service area, but just those zip code level data. So get creative and think about, who's out there that could help us administer this money, because there is money coming down from the federal government. So there's a nonprofit. So the nonprofit, it's a really good question. What does a nonprofit do as part of a payment plan versus a cap? Oftentimes nonprofits aren't the ones administering the payment plans. So in this case, I should have changed the heading on this. This is really about the customer assistance programs with the nonprofits. In terms of the payment plans, they're really administrative heavy at the beginning. So a lot of utilities hadn't planned for extra help and they found they really needed it. So some of the utilities we talked to are part of government organizations. So they pulled folks from Parks and Rec, or they hired temporary employees, or they had an intern. And so just whether, as soon as you get a sense of whether it's going to be in July or later or whenever, really plan for extra help or extra time for your staff to be there at the beginning to get folks enrolled. In North Carolina, we found that a lot of billing software didn't easily incorporate payment plans. A lot of times billing software is made so that the payments always apply to the oldest bill. And that doesn't work really well if you're trying to pay part of an old bill and the current bill. And so people used everything from just total spreadsheet out of the system, re-entering payment information. Like there's all sorts of things across the board. But I would just encourage you to think ahead because it was a rough transition for a lot of utilities here, and hopefully it'll be easier for you all, although it might be difficult if there's no clear guidance on what that's going to look like yet. And then the last thing is just having a clear policy on how customers sign up, who's eligible, what the terms are of the payment plan, and then especially what happens when that payment plan expires. In North Carolina, it expired when people still said COVID's still happening, so there's still a lot of difficulty. In North Carolina, utilities were able to say, okay, there's CARES Act money. Go get the CARES Act money and that will take care of your bill. Or, okay, you can have a 12-month payment plan instead, and we'll just make sure that you have lower payments, but they're still there. You still have to pay your bill, or whatever it is. So just think ahead. Are you going to auto-enroll customers? And we found that communication was really key. So there's one utility that's a pretty large city in North Carolina. They started disconnecting customers as soon as they could, but they communicated with everyone and they kept track and they made sure that their customers knew their options in terms of assistance programs. And so they didn't receive really any negative feedback or any negative press about it. So if you want to talk more, you can read the report or talk to me more about, what happened here. And I'm sure other states have similar stories. But I just encourage you to think ahead when it comes to the payment plans. Okay, so now what you are probably have been waiting for. So, we've talked about customer assistance, but what about these flow restrictors? Well, first off, what is a flow restrictor? It's a small, like quarter-sized piece of metal with a hole drilled in it. That's one kind of flow restrictor, the low-tech, cheaper option. And this quote from somebody at a utility in North Carolina said, if we can prove that there is a way to collect the revenue we need to collect and also make people's lives in delinquent status safer and easier, then I think that's a huge victory. And she was talking about flow restrictors because they had planned this pilot program, and I'll talk more about it later. So, this gives people a little flow of water instead of a lot. So it's super inconvenient. And if they don't want that and they can pay, then they'll pay. But if they can't pay, they can still fill up their water bottle before school or fill up a pot to cook some pasta. They won't be able to run their dishwasher or washing machine, but they might be able to get by for a while. And one of the questions I've gotten from people is, is this a good idea? And, it sounds great in theory. It's just that theory is all we have right now. Phoenix started a program, but it was interrupted by COVID. And so we don't actually have much data out there in terms of if it was effective for compelling payment and how much payment. Another thing to note is that, and we talked about this with the folks in North Carolina, a flow restrictor, being on a flow restrictor for many months may not be safe or desirable. It may lower it lowers the flow and all the pipes in your house. And it's not necessarily a long-term sustainable solution. We don't know what it does to appliances. So something to think about if you're considering flow restrictor is just having a time limit on there, perhaps, or using a flow restrictor long enough that you actually get to communicate with the customer, in a week or two, and then you can tell them about options, or you decide to disconnect or do something else entirely. But just something to keep in mind that a flow restrictor could be a really good option in the short term. But again, there's just not much information out there. Also, in talking to folks, cost-wise, it'll probably be equivalent to a total disconnection reconnection because you're just kind of opening the pipe, putting the flow restrictor in, closing the pipe instead of turning off the pipe. But we're not really sure. So I think if y'all are thinking about flow restrictors, and you would like to ask me about some of the data to track or things to think about, please do, because this pilot program I'm talking about, which I'll detail later on, was going to, and then they didn't, and there's just really not much information out there. So this is our last poll. Have you considered using flow restrictors before today? And would love to hear your answers for that. Some yeses, some nos. Some people who haven't considered them, but will now. Some people discussing it. I think it's growing in popularity. But there are some that say it's probably not gonna happen. Okay, so a little bit more of the story of this North Carolina utility, Cape Fear Public Utility Authority. They decided they were going to pilot a flow restrictor program for for customers who couldn't pay, coming off of the moratorium. So, real quick, somebody mentioned that they are also considering including automatic meters that can be shut off from a remote location. So they also make meters that can restrict flow from a remote location. So you can just program it to give 1/3 flow or 1/10 of the flow or whatever. And I would encourage you to make sure you have your costs and benefits lined up and your reasoning, because sometimes those meters can be really expensive, and it could be totally worth it for your utility. You just have to obviously know that. So Cape Fear, they were going to put flow restrictors in instead of disconnecting people after the moratorium. And they put out a press release about it. But they received a lot of strong pushback from the community. They thought, this is the quote that I had earlier, if we can make someone's life in delinquent status just a little bit easier, then that will be a win. But folks said, why would you cut somebody off in the pandemic? Because they were used to the moratorium, and they thought, something is worth, I think people were used to being not shut off at all. And so when the idea of a flow restrictor came along, they said, well, that's basically shutting us off, don't do it. And also consideration that some folks were worried that it would be seen as children would get taken away by Child Protective Services if they had flow restrictors, because it would be judged an unsafe living environment. So that's something else to consider. But instead, they increased payment plan enrollment and they changed some policies. So Cape Fear is thinking about this kind of along that whole arrow spectrum I was talking about, not just at the disconnection. They kind of were at the beginning with the flow restrictors, but then they were also looking at their rate structures. They allowed some allowance in their fixed charge, and they made increasing blocks so the folks that were using more paid more, and then they separated irrigation charges as well to be able to recover the cost from the high usage of water, and the folks that weren't using much weren't subsidizing that cost, which was happening before. They also had automatic enrollment in payment plans for customers who had over $450 in arrears for at least 60 days. So that's a way that, and that's, I think, just going forward. So that was true for pandemic arrears, but also just going forward, we're just going to automatically enroll you there. And then they're tracking data by census tract as well. So that's something to think about when you're thinking about equity and where folks are having a hard time, and maybe where to target communication and community outreach for payment plans or for disconnection communication. And so that's gonna serve them well. So we have two more case studies that we'll go through quickly. Anna's got the next one.
Yeah, for this next case study, we're gonna hop across the pond to the EU. One important thing to consider when we're thinking about the European Union is that they recognize the human right to water, and I've outlined those tenets right here. Kind of the important one to notice is the EU increases its efforts to achieve universal access to water and sanitation. So we're specifically going to look at the UK, which along with a few other EU countries have outlawed disconnections in response to the recognition of the right to water. You can go back to that map slide, Elsemary. Yeah, so on this slide, we have a map of all the countries that have made this decision. So that includes Austria, France, Ireland, Luxembourg, Poland, Switzerland, and the United Kingdom. And all of these countries do not allow disconnections for missed water payments. So you can go to the next slide. So in the UK, they have 100% access for all UK residents of water, 100% water access, and water disconnection is illegal for non-business customers. But each supplier must have a code of practice for dealing with customer debt. So even though they don't have disconnections as a tool to enforce payment, the UK has developed many other ways to ensure that they generate the revenue they need. This usually takes first the form of a reminder notice, which then leads to a telephone notice. And after that, if a customer has still not paid, their debt is passed to a debt recovery agent. Customers who do not pay can end up with a county court judgment to recover the money they owe. This would either require selling of goods one owns to pay the utility back, or the Department of Work and Pension pays out of the customer's benefits directly to the water company. So they use those tools instead of disconnections to make sure they generate their water revenue.
There's still ways to get revenue. And some of those seem more severe than a disconnection, right? But I think it helps put it in some perspective. The third case study is from a village of Hayworth, Illinois. So the service population is 2,800 folks. And the way that they do their policy, they send out usually about 100 to 150 late letters every billing cycle. And at 45 days, usually it's about 30 accounts get a red door hanger that says, make a payment arrangement or you're going to get disconnected within 48 hours. And it used to be about 90 accounts would get that door tag, but then they started charging a $25 tag fee, which was calculated as the cost and the time of someone going and putting that tag on the door. And so that greatly decreased the number of accounts that you need to get the door hanger. And then they disconnect about 3 to 4 accounts every month, and that disconnection fee is charged on a sliding scale by the cost that it takes to disconnect. And I think just what's fascinating about this is that, you know, they go from 100 to 150 late letters to only 3 to 4 disconnections. And this kind of door hanger and tag fee associated with it, it's still another fee that's added. But you know, there's probably a lot more employees at your district that could go put a door tag on a door instead of go and disconnect the water sewer service. And so this could be, yeah, I think it's just a way where this has worked out really effectively. So they've decreased their disconnections to only a couple accounts a month. With that, I'm going to do a quick summary. Keeping track of your disconnection data can help you, your board, and your customers. They're one way of dealing with non-payment, but you can consider the entire process. And I'd encourage you not to forget that 1% of customers who are not going to be able to pay no matter what. So in summary, I've kind of co-opted the EFC's tagline and said, you know, how you disconnect it matters. We also just quickly want to mention there's a lot of resources at the EFC. We have blog posts, tools that we've made to help you assess financial condition and reports. And we offer free technical assistance as part of an EPA grant for drinking water systems that serve 10,000 or less customers. So you can do drinking and sewer, but has to be at least drinking as it's part of the drinking water program from the EPA. So if you'd like technical assistance, we do affordability assessment, we do some rates analysis, financial health checkups, looking at plans to pay and capital improvement projects, kind of the money side of everything. And we also have some expertise that we have other centers we can refer to for asset management, workforce planning, those sorts of things. And then we're also look for the report coming out in May from the survey. And then we're also seeking funding to do more of a national report and a deeper dive into disconnection data. So if you're interested in participating in that, you can let me know. And with that, I just want to say thank you very much for participating in the chat and being in this session. And I'm going to be at a kind of group chat later on if you want to interact more on the platform. But we have a couple minutes for questions, not very much. But again, you can always email me. I'll put my email in the chat as well. So.
Thank you very much, Elsa Marie and Anna. You know, disconnections will continue to be foremost on managers and commissioners' minds as we move out of this pandemic. So hopefully you've given some things for people to chew on. I will reiterate that I appreciate your openness to being in the chat, group chat. If people have questions, I think that's great. Thank you, everybody, for participating. Our regrets for any technical difficulties with the chat here. And we're going into a lunch break. And then following that will be time to visit the exhibitors. They've been lonely, so if you can spend a few minutes going into their booths, clicking on that virtual trade booth and saying hello and seeing what kind of information, they will greatly appreciate it. Thank you, everybody.